The air in the small cabin is thick with the ghosts of a life that was never truly lived. Alara presses a hand to her still flat stomach, a secret sanctuary of hope and terror. Outside, the wind howls a lonely dirge across the plains, mirroring the emptiness left by her husband, a man she had known for 6 months and mourned for 2. Now, another sound cuts through the wind, the sharp, impatient rap of a fist on the wooden door. It's Silas, her brother-in-law, his presence as welcome as a plague. He doesn't wait for an answer, shoving the door open with a grunt. His eyes, small and greedy, sweep the sparse room, lingering on nothing, for there is nothing of value to see. Nothing except the deed to this patch of dirt he so desperately covets. "It's time, Alara," he says, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The mourning's done. This land belongs to the family. My family." She stands, her body feeling frail, a wave of mourning sickness churning within her. "Silas, please. Just a little more time. The winter's my problem now," he cuts in, taking a step towards her. "Pack your things. The stage runs through Redemption tomorrow. You can be on it." He is a man carved from the same hard rock as the unforgiving land, but without any of its stark beauty. He sees her not as a grieving widow, but as an obstacle. It is in this moment, as his shadow falls over her, that another figure materializes in the doorway, silent as the dusk. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The man is Apache. His name is Kale, though few in the nearby town of Redemption knew it, and fewer still would use it. He is a phantom of the high plains, a man who moves between worlds but belongs to none. He had come to trade pelts, his presence on this land a quiet agreement with her late husband, a man who, for all his faults, held a grudging respect for the Apache tracker. Kale's eyes, dark and perceptive, took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The woman's pale, defiant face, the bully's aggressive posture, the single, worn trunk in the corner that held all her worldly possessions. He said nothing. His silence was a physical thing, a weight in the small room that made Silas turn. Silas sneered. "What do you want, savage?" "This is family business." Kale's gaze did not waver from Alara. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, the desperate fight in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in a doe cornered by wolves. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "The woman stays," and with those 3 words, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. Silas blinked, stupefied, then let out a harsh bark of laughter. "She stays? You have no say here. This is my brother's land. She's nothing now but a squatter." Kale's stillness was more unnerving than any threat. He took a single, deliberate step into the cabin, his moccasins making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. He was not a large man, but he was lean and hard, coiled with a quiet energy that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. He carried the scent of pine and sage and cold, clean air. "Her husband, Thomas, gave me leave to trap on this land until the first deep snow," Kale stated, his tone flat and factual. "The snow has not come. She is his wife. The agreement stands." "The agreement died with him." Silas spat, his face flushing with anger. He was used to being obeyed, to his voice being the loudest in any room. Kale's calm defiance was an infuriating puzzle he couldn't solve. "She's a penniless widow. She has no claim." Alara found her voice, a thread of sound in the charged silence. "The cabin is mine. Thomas built it for me. And the land it sits on is mortgaged to the bank, a debt I intend to settle," Silas retorted, turning his glare back on her. "A debt you cannot possibly pay. You'll be out on your ear one way or another. This just makes it cleaner." He gestured dismissively at Kale. "And you do well to stay out of white folks' affairs." Kale's eyes, which had been fixed on Silas, shifted back to Alara. It was a question, offered without words. "Do you want me to stay?" She held his gaze, and for the first time in months, a flicker of something other than fear sparked within her. It was a desperate, foolish ember of hope. She gave a barely perceptible nod. That was all the answer Kale needed. He turned his body slightly, placing himself more fully between Silas and Alara. It was not an aggressive move, but it was a definitive one. A line had been drawn. "The agreement stands," he repeated, his voice unchanged. "Leave." For a long moment, Silas seemed to weigh his options. He looked at Cale's impassive face, at the hunting knife sheathed at his belt, and at the quiet certainty in his eyes. Silas was a bully, and bullies thrived on fear and weakness. He found neither here. With a final, venomous glare at Alara, he backed out of the cabin. "This isn't over," he snarled, his threat swallowed by the rising wind. "The town will hear about this. A decent woman doesn't keep company with an Apache." The silence he left behind was heavier than the one that had preceded him. Alara's borrowed strength fled, and she sank onto the edge of her cot, her head in her hands. The room felt impossibly small, now occupied by the sheer presence of the man standing by her door. She had known of Cale, of course. Thomas had spoken of him, a mix of derision and awe in his voice. The Indian, who could track a whisper on the wind, who knew the land better than the men who claimed to own it. She had seen him once or twice from a distance, a solitary figure moving along the ridge line at dusk. Now he was here, a stranger who had just declared himself her protector. "Why?" she whispered to the floorboards. Cale did not move from his post by the door. He watched the prairie through the opening, his senses attuned to the world outside. "Your husband was not always a fair man," he said, the words chosen with care. "But he kept his word to me. I will keep mine to him." It was a half-truth, and they both knew it. The real reason was in the look he'd seen on her face, the same cornered desperation that haunted his own past. He knew what it was to be alone, to be judged and cast out. He had a family once, a wife and a small son, lost years ago in a flurry of blue coats and bitter smoke. He never spoke of it. The memory was a cold, hard stone in his chest. In Alara's terror, he saw an echo of his wife's face, and an old, deeply buried instinct to protect had risen, fierce and undeniable. He turned from the door, his gaze finally resting on her. "He will bring others," Cale said. "The sheriff, maybe. You are not safe here alone." The statement hung in the air, a plain and terrible fact. She had nowhere to go, no family to take her in, no money for a stagecoach ticket to a place where she knew no one. This small, drafty cabin and the unforgiving patch of land it sat on was all she had. And now, she had a child to think of. A child conceived not in love, but in a rare, fumbling moment of comfort with a husband who was often cold and distant. A child who would be born into nothing. What am I to do? The question was a breath of despair. Cale's world was a solitary one, a small, well-hidden cabin nestled in a copse of aspens 2 miles up the creek. It was a place of quiet and solitude, a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him. To invite another into that space was unthinkable. Yet, the alternative, to leave this woman to the mercy of men like Silas, was a betrayal of the ghosts he carried. "You will come with me," he said, the decision costing him more than she could ever know. "My camp is hidden. You will be safe there until the snows pass and you can decide what to do." Alara looked up at him, at his dark, unreadable face, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hardship and sorrow. He was a stranger, an Apache. The town, her late husband, everything she had ever known had taught her to fear him. But in his eyes, she saw not menace, but a profound and weary stillness. It was the most honest thing she had seen all day. Trusting him was a leap into the unknown, a terrifying gamble. But staying here was a certainty of ruin. Taking a shaky breath, she stood up. "All right," she said. The journey to his cabin was short but arduous. He carried her trunk as if it weighed nothing, leading her away from the path, along a game trail that was nearly invisible to the untrained eye. His cabin was smaller than hers, but it was solid, built with a skill that spoke of patience and foresight. A stone hearth dominated one wall, and the single room was neat and orderly. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and neatly stacked piles of firewood promised warmth against the coming winter. There was a single sleeping pallet of furs in one corner. The awkwardness between them was a chasm. He gave her the pallet without discussion, taking a simple blanket for himself on the floor by the hearth. They did not speak of what had happened, or what would happen next. He prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew, and they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the ever-present moan of the wind outside. For the first time in weeks, Alara felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the simple, profound relief of feeling safe. Days bled into a week. Their lives fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. He would leave before dawn to check his trap lines, returning in the afternoon with game or news of the world beyond their hidden valley. Alara, her initial fear slowly receding, took over the small domestic tasks. She mended his worn buckskin shirt with thread from her own dwindling supply, cooked their meals, and kept the fire fed. She found a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin and worked to salvage what she could of the late-season vegetables. They communicated in gestures and necessities. "The water bucket is low. I saw tracks. Silas rode the west ridge today. This stew needs salt." Yet, in these sparse exchanges, a fragile understanding began to grow. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, to know by the tilt of his head when he was listening to a sound she couldn't hear. He, in turn, began to see past the pale, frightened widow. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw as she scrubbed a pot, the quiet grace in her hands as she kneaded dough for flatbread, the fierce, protective way she would instinctively rest a hand on her belly when she thought he wasn't looking. The pregnancy was their great unspoken secret. He knew. He had known from the moment he first saw her in her cabin, had seen the faint blue veins at her temples and the weary shadows under her eyes. It explained her desperation and Silas's urgency to be rid of her. A pregnant widow was a scandal, a stain on a family's name. For an Apache, to whom family and the continuation of one's people was sacred, her condition was not a shame, but a responsibility he had unknowingly shouldered. Their first real test came 10 days after she arrived. Their supplies were running low, and a trip to redemption was unavoidable. Cale was reluctant. "I will go alone," he said. "No," Alara replied, her voice firm. "I need things. Things for the winter." She couldn't bring herself to say for the baby, "And if you go alone, it will only feed the rumors. They will say you've taken me captive." He saw the logic in her words. So they went together, riding his single, steady pack horse, Alara seated in front of him. The proximity was unnerving for both of them. She was acutely aware of the solid wall of his chest at her back, of the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was conscious of her fragility, the slightness of her frame, and the warmth of her body against his. Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that held more judgment than charity. As they rode in, a hush fell over the boardwalk. Windows parted, conversations ceased. Every eye was on them, the Apache and the widow. Alara kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her face a pale mask, but Cale could feel the tension vibrating through her body. Inside the general store, the proprietor, a balding man named Henderson, served them with a cold, grudging efficiency. As Alara pointed to flour, salt, and beans, a woman at the back of the store whispered loudly to her companion. "Shameless. Barely 2 months since poor Thomas was in the ground." Alara flinched as if struck. Cale, who was standing behind her, placed a hand lightly on the small of her back. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of support. A silent command. "I am here. Do not break." The warmth of his hand through her thin dress was a steadying anchor in a sea of hostility. As they stepped back outside, their ordeal escalated. Silas was waiting for them, the town sheriff at his side. Sheriff Brody was a big man, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, his face perpetually florid with whiskey and self-importance. "Cale," Brody said, his voice a low growl. "Folks are saying you're holding this woman against her will." "She is with me by choice," Cale said, his voice even. "Is that so, Mrs. Miller?" the sheriff asked, turning his gaze on Alara. His eyes raked over her, noting her slightly fuller figure, and a smirk touched his lips. "Heard some other things, too. Heard you're putting a stain on your husband's good name." "My husband is dead," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. "My affairs are my own. Not when you're living in sin with a redskin on land that belongs to my family," Silas shouted, stepping forward. Cale moved almost imperceptibly, shifting his body to block Silas's path to Alara. "She is under my protection," he said, his eyes locking with the sheriff's. "Protection?" Brody scoffed. "In the territory of Wyoming, that looks a lot like kidnapping. Unless, of course, you have some legal claim to her." The insinuation was ugly and clear. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. They had no legal claim. They were nothing to each other in the eyes of the law. They were an outcast and a pariah, and the law was not on their side. "You've got until the end of the week," the sheriff declared, his voice booming for the benefit of the watching crowd. "You either turn her over to her brother-in-law, her rightful guardian, or I'll come up to that mountain myself and burn you out." The ride back to the cabin was a study in grim silence. The unspoken had now been shouted in the middle of a dusty street. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered. That night, the chasm between them felt wider than ever. Alara lay on her pallet, staring into the darkness, a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She was trapped. She had traded one cage for another, and this one was about to be destroyed. Cale sat by the dying fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. He was thinking of the past, of the blue-coated soldiers who had come to his village with legal papers and righteous fury. They had spoken of laws and claims, and the end result was fire and death. The sheriff's threat was not an idle one. He had seen it before. He would not let it happen again. He stopped sharpening the knife and looked over at the still form on the pallet. He could not see her face in the dark, but he could feel her fear. He had brought this upon her. His intervention, his offer of safety, had only painted a larger target on her back. There was only one path forward, a path so radical and unthinkable that the thought of it made his own guarded heart clench. "We will get married," he said into the darkness. Alara sat bolt upright. "What?" He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the glowing embers. The sheriff spoke of a legal claim. A husband has a legal claim. A husband's home is his wife's home. It is the only way they will leave you be. The idea was insane. A marriage of convenience. A piece of paper from a world he despised to protect them from that same world. Marry a stranger? An Apache? The scandal would be immense, but it would be a legal scandal, one the sheriff would have a harder time fighting. "They'll never marry us," she whispered. "No preacher in redemption would do it." "There is a judge in Fort Laramie," Cale said. "He is a hard man, but he cares only for the letter of the law, not the color of a man's skin. I have dealt with him before. He will do it." The silence stretched, filled with the enormity of his proposal. This was not about love or affection. It was a strategic move in a war for survival. It was a shield, but it was also a bond, an irrevocable tying of her life, and her child's life, to this quiet, lonely man. She thought of Silas's greedy eyes, of the sheriff's leering smirk, of the cold, lonely road she would be forced to walk. Then she thought of Cale's steady presence, of the unexpected safety she felt in his cabin, of the way he had placed his hand on her back in the store. "All right," she said again, her voice barely a whisper in the night. "We will get married." The journey to Fort Laramie took 3 days. They spoke little, the weight of their decision creating a new, more complicated silence between them. This was no longer a temporary arrangement. They were about to bind themselves together, two solitary souls forging an alliance against a hostile world. Alara found herself studying him, noticing the small things, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the gentleness with which he treated the horse, the patience he showed when she struggled to keep up on a steep trail. Judge Morrison was exactly as Cale had described him, a gaunt, sour-faced man with eyes like chips of granite. He peered at them over his spectacles from behind a massive oak desk, his office smelling of stale cigar smoke and old paper. "You want to marry this woman?" he asked Cale, his tone laced with disbelief. "Yes," Cale said. The judge turned to Alara. "And you, miss? You enter this union of your own free will." "I do," Alara said, her voice stronger than she expected. The judge sighed, a long, weary sound. He clearly found the entire situation distasteful, but as Cale had predicted, his respect for the law outweighed his prejudice. He filled out the paperwork with scratchy strokes of his pen, asked them the required questions, and pronounced them man and wife with all the ceremony of a man ordering feed. He charged them $1, which Cale paid with a worn silver coin. And just like that, it was done. They were married. The ride back was different. The silence was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken fears. It was something else, something deeper. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a unit, a family, at least on paper. That night, camped under a blanket of stars, Cale built a larger fire than usual. As Alara stared into the flames, her mind reeling, he spoke, his voice low. "I had a wife," he said, the words coming out as if they were being pulled from deep within the earth. "Her name was Kamalis. It means bluebird. We had a son. He was small, but his laugh was loud." Alara turned to look at him, her heart aching. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on a distant, painful memory. Soldiers came. They said our land was part of a new treaty. They said we had to leave. My people argued. There was a fight. He paused, his jaw tightening. I was away, hunting. When I came back, there was only smoke. And silence. I found them near the creek. He fell silent, but the story hung in the air, a testament to a grief so profound it had shaped the very core of him. Alara finally understood. She understood his solitude, his distrust of the white man's world, his fierce, immediate instinct to protect her. He wasn't just saving her. He was trying to right a terrible wrong that could never be undone, trying to protect a new family from the ghosts of the one he had lost. Tears welled in her eyes, for his loss, for her own, for the cruel, hard world they lived in. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. He flinched, surprised by the contact, but he did not pull away. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. They sat like that for a long time, two strangers bound by law and loss, the flickering firelight casting their shadows long against the rocks. In that moment, something shifted. The paper in Cale's saddlebag was just a legal document. This shared vulnerability, this quiet act of comfort, felt more like a true marriage than any words a judge could utter. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sheriff's deadline had passed. They both knew a confrontation was inevitable. They spent the next 2 days preparing, not for a fight with guns, but for a battle of wills. Cale reinforced the cabin door and brought in extra firewood and water. Alara baked bread and made a large pot of stew, small domestic acts of defiance. They were building a home, daring the world to tear it down. On the third morning, they came. Sheriff Brody, Silas, and a half-dozen deputized townsmen, their horses churning up the soft earth of the valley. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin, a grim line of armed men. "Cale," Brody bellowed, "I gave you a warning. Send the woman out now." The cabin door opened. Cale stepped out, unarmed. He stood on the small porch, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. A moment later, Alara appeared at his side. She held a piece of paper in her hand. "There's no need for this, Sheriff," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "You have no authority here." "The hell I don't." Brody growled, dismounting. "That woman is coming with me." "This woman," Alara said, taking a step forward, "is my husband's wife. And this cabin is our home." She held up the marriage certificate, the judge's signature a dark slash on the page. A stunned silence fell over the posse. Silas's face went from red to purple. "That's a lie. A trick. It's a legal document, registered at Fort Laramie," Cale said, his voice carrying easily in the crisp morning air. "You can check for yourself. She is my wife. You are trespassing on my land." He used the white man's words, legal, registered, trespassing, like weapons. Sheriff Brody stared at the paper, then at Cale's impassive face, then at Alara's defiant one. He was thwarted. He could not forcibly remove a woman from her legal husband's home without a judge's order, and he knew it. His authority, built on bluster and intimidation, had hit a wall of solid law. But Silas was not constrained by the law. His rage boiled over. "She's carrying my brother's child," he roared, the accusation finally spoken aloud. She soiled his memory, shacking up with him. He pointed a trembling finger at Cale. "That child will inherit this land. I won't have my blood raised by an Indian." The men in the posse shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer about the law. It was about something uglier, something far more personal. It was Alara who answered, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "You're right, Silas," she said, her eyes flashing. "I am carrying Thomas's child. A child he never wanted. A child he called a burden the night before he died." The posse murmured, looking at one another. "You talk about his memory? I remember a man with a cold heart and a heavy hand. I remember being alone and afraid. This man," she said, turning to look up at Cale, "showed me kindness. He gave me shelter when my own family would have thrown me to the wolves. He is more of a husband to me in 2 weeks than Thomas was in 6 months, and he will be a better father to this child than its own blood ever would have been." Her words struck the men with the force of a physical blow. They had come expecting to rescue a damsel in distress, a fallen woman held captive by a savage. Instead, they found a woman standing proudly by her husband, defending her choice and speaking a truth about the sainted Thomas Miller that no one had dared to voice. Cale placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple, public gesture of ownership and protection. He looked directly at the sheriff. "The law says she is my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Our traditions say that a man who takes a widow as his wife also takes her child as his own. This child," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the men, "is my child now. This family is my family. Anyone who threatens them, threatens me." There was no boast in his words, only a simple, unshakable statement of fact. The men of the posse looked at Silas, whose face was a mask of pure, impotent fury, and then at the united couple on the porch. They saw a man defending his home, and a woman who had finally found her voice. The righteous anger that had brought them here curdled into shame. One by one, they began to back their horses away, muttering excuses. They were not lawmen. They were bullies, and their target was refusing to be bullied. Soon, only Sheriff Brody and Silas remained. Brody, defeated, spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he grumbled, but there was no conviction in it. He heaved himself onto his horse and rode away without a backward glance. Silas stood alone, his hatred a palpable force. He stared at Alara, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll regret this," he hissed, before turning and stomping back to his horse. As the sound of the hoofbeats faded, a profound quiet settled over the valley. It was over. The threat, for now, had been vanquished. Alara felt the tension drain out of her, leaving her weak-kneed. She leaned against Cale, and his arm came around her, holding her steady. They stood there on the porch of their small cabin, husband and wife, a family forged in adversity. He turned her to face him, his dark eyes searching hers. The chasm between them was gone, bridged by the stand they had just taken. He saw not a frightened widow, but a warrior. She saw not a lonely outcast, but her protector, her husband. He slowly raised his hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the first truly tender gesture that had passed between them. Then, his gaze dropped to her belly, which was now just beginning to show its slight curve. With infinite care, he moved his other hand and laid it flat against her stomach, over the new life that had brought them together. He felt a faint flutter, a tiny kick, a response from the child within. A slow, rare smile touched Cale's lips. It transformed his stern face, chasing away the shadows of grief. In that moment, the child of Thomas Miller truly became his. He looked back into Alara's eyes, and she smiled back, tears of relief and a dawning, unexpected joy tracing paths down her cheeks. The wind whispered through the aspens, the sun warmed their faces, and inside their small, embattled sanctuary, a new life and a new love had just begun. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.